They weren't supposed to be this far inland by nightfall. That's what every Allied commander believed on June 6, 1944. But when the sun set over Normandy, France, one Canadian unit had rewritten the rules. The Regina rifles and Royal Winnipeg rifles had pushed 9 miles inland from Juno Beach, 9 miles farther than any other Allied force on the most important day of World War II. This is the untold story of how 2 Canadian rifle regiments defied impossible odds, how they overcame the strongest German defenses on the entire Normandy coastline, and how their aggressive tactics changed modern warfare forever. June 5, 1944, somewhere in the English Channel, 14,000 Canadian soldiers crowded into landing craft that pitched violently in 10-foot waves. The cold ocean spray soaked through their uniforms. Many men were violently seasick. They had been at sea for hours, circling in the darkness, waiting for dawn. These were men of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade. Their mission was to assault a stretch of beach codenamed Juno. But this was not just any beach. Juno Beach was one of the most heavily fortified positions in Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Intelligence reports showed concrete bunkers 8 feet thick, 88mm guns that could punch through tank armor like paper, machine gun nests covering every inch of sand, mines buried in the beach, and obstacles designed to rip the bottom out of landing craft. 21,000 German defenders waited behind those walls. Among the Canadian soldiers heading toward Juno Beach were 2 rifle regiments that would make history. The Regina Rifles from Saskatchewan, known for their discipline and determination, and the Royal Winnipeg Rifles from Manitoba, nicknamed the Little Black Devils. Both units were part of the 7th Canadian Infantry Brigade, one of the first assault waves. These men carried the weight of memory with them across the dark water. 2 years earlier, Canadians had attempted to assault the French coast at a place called Dieppe. That operation followed all the conventional military rules for amphibious assault. The commanders were careful, methodical, and followed the textbook exactly. The result was catastrophic. 68% of the Canadian soldiers became casualties. More than half the force was killed, wounded, or captured in just 9 hours of fighting. The memory of Dieppe hung over every Canadian approaching Juno Beach like a dark cloud. Would history repeat itself? Or had they learned something from that terrible day? Major General Rod Keller commanded the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. He was 42 years old and not what anyone expected in a major general. Keller was not from a famous military family. He had not graduated at the top of his class at the military academy. Other generals wore their medals proudly and spoke in grand strategic terms. Keller was blunt, practical, and direct. But Keller had learned something from the Dieppe disaster that the textbooks did not teach. He had spent months studying the operation, talking to survivors, examining the timing. His conclusion challenged everything the military establishment believed about amphibious warfare. The problem at Dieppe was not that the Canadians had been too aggressive. The problem was they had not been aggressive enough. They had followed the slow, methodical approach. They had paused to consolidate positions and assess the situation. And while they paused, the Germans cut them to pieces. Keller realized that the kill zone on a beach is not a place to be careful. It is a place to run through as fast as possible. The most dangerous place in a beach assault is not the waterline. It is the zone between the waterline and the enemy fortifications. That zone is where the Germans have perfect firing angles. That zone is where soldiers are most exposed with nowhere to hide. And the longer you stay in that zone, the more men you lose. Conventional doctrine said landing waves should be spaced 3 minutes apart. This gave troops time to establish defensive positions, and commanders time to assess. Keller wanted 30-second intervals instead. Instead of letting troops bunch up and consolidate, he wanted them to keep moving forward. Instead of caution, he wanted speed. Instead of following doctrine, he wanted momentum. When Keller presented his plan to Allied headquarters, the response was immediate resistance. American advisors said it violated basic amphibious assault principles. British observers said it would cause chaos and disaster. The troops would bunch up, they warned. The formations would break down completely. It would be a bloodbath worse than Dieppe. But Keller had one crucial supporter, Admiral Percy Nels, head of the Royal Canadian Navy. Nels had also studied Dieppe carefully. He had also seen the conventional approach fail spectacularly. Nels used his influence to let Keller train his troops in this new aggressive method. For 6 months, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division practiced. They practiced moving fast under fire. They practiced ignoring the instinct to take cover and hide. They practiced pushing forward even when every fiber of their being screamed to stop. The soldiers knew this approach was different from anything they had been taught. Some were scared that it would get them killed. Some thought it was crazy to ignore conventional wisdom. But they trusted Keller, and they remembered Dieppe. They did not want to die following a plan that had already failed once. The Canadians also had another advantage that many people do not know about. They brought 80 specialized tanks called Hobart's Funnies to Juno Beach. These were not regular tanks. They were engineering marvels. Some had large rotating drums on the front that detonated mines as they advanced. Others had huge bundles of logs they could drop into ditches to create instant bridges. Some had flamethrowers that could shoot streams of fire into bunkers. Others had massive mortars that could blast through concrete walls. The Canadians had more of these specialized vehicles than any other beach on D-Day. American commanders had refused most of them for Omaha and Utah beaches. The Americans called the specialized tanks unnecessary and overcomplicated. The Canadians took everything they could get their hands on. As dawn broke on June 6, 1944, the sea was still rough. 10-foot waves crashed against the landing craft heading toward Juno Beach. The rough seas meant the landing would be delayed. Your hour for Juno Beach was set for 7:35 in the morning. But the waves and poor visibility forced the naval commanders to push the timing back. This delay would have consequences no one could predict. The Regina rifles were assigned to land on Nan Green sector at Courcelles-sur-Mer. This was the most heavily fortified position on all the Anglo-Canadian beaches. German defenses included one 75mm gun, one 88mm gun, 3 50mm anti-tank guns, 12 machine gun pillboxes, 2 50mm mortars, plus 2 additional 75mm guns on the flanks. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles would land on Mike Red and Mike Green sectors, west of the Soules River. Their mission was to clear the beach and push inland toward the village of Crewley. Lieutenant Colonel F.M. Matheson commanded the Regina Rifles. Lieutenant Colonel J.M. Meldrum commanded the Royal Winnipeg Rifles. Both men had drilled their soldiers relentlessly in the aggressive momentum tactics. Both knew that the next few hours would determine whether Keller's theory was brilliant or suicidal. At 7:49 in the morning, the Royal Winnipeg Rifles hit Mike Red and Mike Green beaches. B Company and D Company assaulted first, with A Company and C Company held in reserve. The battalion war diary recorded what happened next in stark, brutal language. Quote, "The bombardment having failed to kill a single German or silence one weapon. These companies had to storm their positions cold, and did so without hesitation. The naval and air bombardment that was supposed to soften up the defenses had done almost nothing. The concrete bunkers were too thick, the German positions too well designed. B Company of the Winnipeg Rifles came under heavy machine gun and shell fire as they approached shore. Men fell into the cold water, weighted down by 60 pounds of equipment. Those who made it to the beach faced a wall of bullets and explosions. But they did not stop. They did not pause. They did not take cover. They ran forward through the fire just as they had been trained. The specialized tanks of A Squadron, 1st Hussars, were supposed to land ahead of the infantry, but the rough seas delayed them, and many of the amphibious tanks struggled in the waves. The duplex drive tanks had a floating skirt that allowed them to swim to shore. But 10-foot waves crashed over the skirts and swamped several tanks before they reached land. When the tanks that survived finally made it ashore, they immediately went to work. The Canadians used their specialized armor to devastating effect. B Company of the Winnipeg Rifles neutralized German pillboxes with the aid of the 1st Hussars tanks. They crossed the Soules River and cleared enemy positions on the island between the river and harbor. This is where the Juno Beach Center Museum stands today. D Company of the Winnipeg Rifles met less opposition when landing. They were clear of the main German strongpoint and moved quickly through a minefield at La Valette. By 800 hours, they had cleared the village of Grès-sur-Mer. The reserve companies, A Company and C Company, landed under heavy mortar and machine gun fire. A company pushed inland toward Sainte-Croix-sur-Mer and took the town with tank support. C Company advanced to Banville with little opposition. 16 minutes after the Winnipeg Rifles landed, the Regina rifles hit Nan Green Beach. It was 8:05 in the morning when A Company, Regina rifles, reached the sand. They were met with a storm of fire from the heavily fortified positions at Courseulles. An 88mm gun opened up, tearing through the landing craft and the men inside. The men of A Company lay huddled on the beach, pinned down by withering fire. For a moment, it looked like Dieppe all over again. Then Lieutenant Bill Grayson made a decision that would become legendary in Canadian military history. He made a mad dash for the German emplacement housing the 88mm gun. A German soldier saw him coming and threw a potato masher grenade. The grenade landed between Grayson's legs and should have killed him instantly. Coolly, without hesitation, Grayson reached down and threw the grenade back at the German. It exploded among the defenders, killing several men. Grayson then followed the Germans into a zigzagging trench that led to an underground bunker. Moments later, 35 German soldiers emerged with their hands raised. Grayson had single-handedly captured the strongest defensive position on the beach. With the 88mm gun silenced, A Company was able to push into Courseulles. B Company of the Regina rifles landed 10 minutes later at 8:15. C Company came ashore at 8:35 and D Company at 8:55. Each wave landed exactly on schedule, just 30 seconds to 1 minute apart. The beach became a continuous flow of soldiers and tanks pushing inland. This was Keller's plan in action, and it was working. The supporting arms had done a wonderful job, as Major Baird of the Regina Rifles later wrote. Baker Squadron of the 6th Canadian Armored Regiment, the 1st Hussars, gave invaluable aid. Guns of the 13th Field Regiment proved excellent support in the initial landing phases. Elements of the Cameron Highlanders of Ottawa, the support battalion, were also crucial. Reconnaissance groups from the 17th Duke of York's Royal Canadian Hussars helped guide the advance. The 3rd Anti-Tank Regiment provided firepower against German strongpoints. By 900 hours, less than 1 hour after first landing, something remarkable was happening. The Regina Rifles and Winnipeg Rifles had broken through the Atlantic Wall completely. The mine-clearing tanks had opened up 6 separate paths through the German defenses. Engineers used Bangalore torpedoes to blow up barbed wire obstacles. They threw satchel charges into bunkers and marked safe paths with white tape. More troops poured through these gaps in an unstoppable tide. The specialized tanks had done exactly what they were designed to do. 70% of the German fortifications in the immediate landing zone were destroyed or abandoned. As the companies overcame resistance in their areas, they pushed inland to the village of Rivière. C Company of the Regina Rifles moved up to Rivieres first. Battalion headquarters was established there at 1500 hours, 3 in the afternoon. B Company and A Company arrived next, and the battalion rested briefly. But Keller's plan called for no extended pauses, only brief halts to regroup. The Regina Rifles began to advance southward from Rivière at about 1700 hours. By 2000 hours, 8 in the evening, both Fontaine-Henri and La Fresne-Camilly were in their hands. The speed of the advance was shocking everyone, including the Canadians themselves. At Allied headquarters, American and British officers watched with disbelief. Reports were coming in that the Canadians had penetrated 2 miles inland, then 3 miles, then 5 miles, then 6 miles. At Omaha Beach, American troops were still pinned down at the waterline. At Utah Beach, the Americans had barely moved past the seawall. At Golden Sword beaches, British forces were making good progress but staying relatively close to the coast. But the Canadians at Juno Beach were racing into the French countryside. American General Omar Bradley stood on the deck of the USS Augusta with binoculars. He was watching the Canadian sector with a mixture of amazement and confusion. Bradley was one of the most experienced American commanders in the entire European theater. He had planned operations in North Africa, Sicily, and across the Mediterranean. He knew amphibious warfare as well as anyone alive. And he was watching something he had never seen before in his entire career. Canadian troops were not just holding their beachhead and consolidating positions. They were racing inland faster than any plan had anticipated. Their tanks were already disappearing into the Norman hedgerows and villages. Supply vehicles were moving freely on the beach without taking heavy fire. The Germans were retreating, not counterattacking. One of Bradley's colonels, a man named James Rudder, spoke quietly to his staff. His exact words were later recorded in military documents and war diaries. Rudder said, "The Canadians fight like they've got something to prove." It was meant as an observation, not an insult, and it touched on something profound. The Canadians did have something to prove to the world and to themselves. They had been dismissed as colonial troops by some American and British officers. They had suffered through the disaster at Dieppe and carried that shame. They carried the weight of being underestimated and overlooked, and that weight had transformed into fuel for an unstoppable advance. By noon on June 6th, the entire 3rd Canadian Infantry Division was ashore. 21,400 men had landed on Juno Beach. Leading elements had pushed several kilometers inland to seize bridges over the Sewell River. The 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade, which had been held in reserve, landed around 11:40. This brigade consisted of the Cameron Highlanders of Ottawa, the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, the Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry Highlanders, and the Highland Light Infantry of Canada. They were supported by the 27th Armoured Regiment, the Sherbrooke Fusiliers. When the 9th Brigade's landing craft touched down, they found the beach already clearing. Engineers were removing obstacles, medics were treating wounded, and supplies were flowing. The beach that should have been a killing zone had become a supply depot in just 4 hours. The 9th Brigade was ordered to push even deeper inland toward their ambitious D-Day objectives. The North Nova Scotia Highlanders and Sherbrooke Fusiliers were ordered to capture Carpiquet Aerodrome. This airfield sat several miles inland near the city of Cone. Meanwhile, the Regina Rifles and Royal Winnipeg Rifles continued their relentless push. By 1300 hours, 1 in the afternoon, Canadians had seized a crucial highway. The Combayou Highway, National Route 13, was one of the main arteries in Normandy. Control of this road would allow the Allies to move supplies and reinforcements rapidly. It would also cut off German forces trying to move laterally along the coast. The sound of battle had changed dramatically from the morning chaos. In the early hours, the beach had been filled with thunder of naval guns and machine gun fire. The air had been thick with the smell of cordite, burning fuel, and salt water. Now, by early afternoon, the heavy firing was moving inland and growing fainter. On the beach itself, the sounds were completely different. Bulldozers clearing obstacles, engineers shouting instructions, landing craft engines bringing supplies. The beach had transformed from battlefield into logistics hub in less than 6 hours. The smell had changed too, from explosives to diesel fuel and churned earth. Medics moved among the wounded with practiced efficiency. Chaplains said prayers over the dead who lay covered with blankets. But the flow of troops and supplies never stopped for even a moment. Wave after wave of reinforcements came ashore, and each wave moved immediately inland. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles pushed toward their final objective of the day. By 1400 hours, 2 in the afternoon, they had advanced to Crowley. This historic Norman town sat astride a key road junction several miles inland. German resistance in Crowley was lighter than expected. The rapid Canadian advance had caught the defenders completely off guard. German units were still trying to organize counterattacks when Canadians were already miles beyond them. The continuous momentum that Keller insisted on was proving devastatingly effective. At 1400 hours, something unprecedented in D-Day operations happened. A German officer approached Canadian lines under a white flag of surrender. He was a major in the 7th and 16th Infantry Division that had been defending the Juno sector. Through an interpreter, he said his entire regiment wanted to discuss terms. The Canadian commander who met with him was surprised. Surrender negotiations usually took days of fighting and discussion. But the German major explained that more than 800 of his men wanted to surrender immediately. They had been completely overwhelmed by the speed and aggression of the Canadian assault. He said they had fought British and American forces before in North Africa and Italy. But this was different. This was something they had never experienced. The Canadians attacked like men possessed by fury and determination. The German major's surrender was not an isolated incident. Throughout the afternoon, German units across the Juno sector began giving up. By 1500 hours, 3 in the afternoon, more than 2,000 German soldiers had surrendered. Entire defensive positions were being abandoned without a fight. The 716th Infantry Division, supposed to hold the coast for days, was falling apart in hours. German commanders desperately tried to counter the Canadian breakthrough. They sent in their strategic reserve, the powerful 21st Panzer Division. This division was equipped with Mark IV tanks and assault guns. These were some of the best armored vehicles the Germans had in Normandy. But the German tanks ran into an unexpected problem. The Canadians had already pushed so far inland that panzers could not establish good defensive positions. Instead of fighting from prepared locations with clear fields of fire, Germans had to attack while moving. And moving attacks against dug-in infantry with tank support rarely went well. Elements of the 21st Panzer Division did manage to launch a counterattack. They struck at the gap between Juno Beach and Sword Beach around 1600 hours. Some German tanks actually reached the coast between the two beachheads. For a brief moment, it looked like the Germans might split the Allied invasion force. But the counterattack came too late, and with too few tanks, Canadian and British forces quickly responded and drove the panzers back. By 1700 hours, 5 in the afternoon, the German counterattack had failed completely. The opportunity to stop the invasion at the beach was gone forever. Meanwhile, the Regina Rifles continued their push toward their final objective. Their mission was to reach the village of Bretteville-l'Orgueilleuse, 9 miles from Juno Beach. This was the furthest inland objective assigned to any Allied unit on D-Day. Military planners had expected it would take 3 to 4 days to reach Bretteville. The Regina Rifles planned to get there before nightfall. At 1700 hours, the battalion began its final advance from Rivière. They moved through the Norman countryside in tactical formation. Tanks led the way, followed by infantry in half-tracks and on foot. The landscape of Normandy is distinctive, with small fields divided by thick hedgerows. These hedgerows were ancient earthen banks topped with dense vegetation. They provided perfect cover for defenders and made advancing difficult. But the Regina Rifles had maintained such speed that German forces had no time to organize proper defenses. By 2000 hours, 8 in the evening, the Regina Rifles had captured Fontaine-Henry. This village sat just 2 miles from Bretteville-l'Orgueilleuse. The sun was getting lower in the sky now, casting long shadows across the fields. The Regina Rifles had been fighting for more than 12 hours straight. Many men had not eaten since before dawn when they were still on the landing craft. They were exhausted. Their uniforms were soaked with sweat and seawater. Their hands were blistered from carrying weapons and ammunition. But they kept moving forward because that was what they had trained to do. Lieutenant Colonel Matheson gathered his company commanders for a quick conference. The question was simple: push on to Bretteville or dig in for the night. Conventional military wisdom said to stop and consolidate. The men were tired. Supply lines were stretched and fighting in darkness was dangerous. But Matheson remembered Keller's orders. Maintain momentum. Never give the enemy time to recover. The decision was made to push on. At 2100 hours, 9 in the evening, the Regina Rifles approached Bretteville-l'Orgueilleuse. The village was quiet, with only scattered rifle fire coming from German positions. Elements of the German 12th SS Panzer Division were in the area. This was a fanatical unit composed of young Nazi volunteers, some barely 18 years old. They had a reputation for fierce fighting and no mercy. But even the 12th SS Panzer Division was not prepared for what hit them that evening. The Regina Rifles attacked Bretteville with tanks and infantry working in perfect coordination. Sherman tanks from the 1st Hussars fired high explosive rounds into suspected enemy positions. Infantry squads moved building to building, clearing the village systematically. By 2200 hours, 10 in the evening, Bretteville-l'Orgueilleuse was in Canadian hands. The Regina Rifles had reached their D-Day objective, 9 miles inland from Juno Beach. They had advanced farther than any other Allied unit on June 6, 1944. No American, British, or Canadian force had penetrated deeper into Normandy on D-Day. As darkness fell completely over Normandy, the Canadians began to dig in for the night. They established defensive positions around Bretteville and the other villages they had captured. Sentries were posted, ammunition was distributed, and exhausted men tried to rest. The night was filled with the sounds of distant artillery and occasional small arms fire. German forces were still out there in the darkness, regrouping and planning counterattacks. But for now, the Canadians held a salient that reached 9 miles into occupied France. Back at Allied headquarters, staff officers were updating maps based on the day's results. When they plotted the Canadian positions, they had to double-check the coordinates. The advance seemed impossible, but report after report confirmed it was true. The Canadians had achieved something that military experts said could not be done. General Omar Bradley sent a message to General Rod Keller that night. The exact wording was recorded in military archives. Bradley wrote, "The advance of the 3rd Canadian Division has exceeded all expectations. Their aggressive tactics have proven highly effective. Please convey my congratulations to your officers and men." It was a remarkable acknowledgement from an American general who had been skeptical of Canadian methods. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery also took notice of the Canadian success. Montgomery was the overall ground commander for the invasion and a demanding perfectionist. He rarely gave praise, but he sent word that the Canadians had performed brilliantly. As midnight approached on June 6th, the statistics of the day were being compiled. The numbers told a story that would reshape military thinking for generations to come. At Omaha Beach, American forces had advanced approximately 5 miles inland by day's end. They had suffered approximately 3,000 casualties in the bloodiest landing of D-Day. At Utah Beach, Americans had pushed about 6 miles inland with lighter casualties. At Gold Beach, British forces had advanced about 6 miles. At Sword Beach, the British had reached about 5 miles inland. At Juno Beach, the Canadians had penetrated 9 miles into enemy territory. The Canadian casualties were significant, but far lower than predicted. Pre-invasion planners had expected casualty rates similar to the disaster at Dieppe. They predicted 60 to 70% losses in the first wave. The actual numbers were drastically different from these grim predictions. 340 Canadian soldiers were killed on Juno Beach and in the advance beyond it. 574 were wounded, and 47 were taken prisoner. Out of 21,400 men who landed, this represented roughly 4.5% casualties. The aggressive momentum approach that military experts said would cause a bloodbath had actually saved lives. Men were still dying, men were still being wounded. War is never clean or easy. But the tactics that defied conventional wisdom had proven devastatingly effective. The Canadians had broken through the Atlantic Wall, advanced 9 miles, and done it with fewer losses than expected. The Germans defending Juno Beach had suffered catastrophic losses. The 716th Infantry Division was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. More than 2,000 soldiers had surrendered. Hundreds more were dead or wounded. The division that was supposed to hold the coast for days had collapsed in hours. 340 German fortified positions had been neutralized. Some were destroyed by Canadian tanks or artillery fire. Some were captured by infantry assaults with grenades and satchel charges. Some were simply abandoned when German troops retreated inland in panic. The Atlantic Wall, which Hitler had boasted was impregnable, had a 9-mile-wide hole punched through it. As the soldiers of the Regina Rifles and Royal Winnipeg Rifles tried to sleep that night, they did not fully understand what they had accomplished. They were too exhausted, too focused on survival to think about history. They had done their jobs, followed their training, and pushed forward when others might have stopped. But in the months and years that followed, the significance of June 6th would become clear. The impact of what happened at Juno Beach did not end when the sun set on D-Day. In the days and weeks that followed, military commanders across all Allied forces began studying what the Canadians had done. Staff officers requested detailed reports and tactical breakdowns. Training instructors asked for explanations of the momentum doctrine. The aggressive approach that had been dismissed as reckless before D-Day was now being examined as potential standard doctrine. Within 2 weeks of the landing, British units began incorporating elements of Canadian tactics. When the Allies pushed toward Caen, British commanders told their troops to maintain forward pressure. "Do not pause to consolidate unless absolutely necessary," the orders said. "Keep the Germans off balance. Never give them time to regroup." The lessons of Juno Beach were spreading through the Allied armies like ripples in a pond. American forces took longer to adapt, but they too began to change their approach. By July 1944, American training manuals were being rewritten. The sections on amphibious assault were modified based on Canadian experience. The old guidance about 3-minute spacing between waves was questioned and revised. New emphasis was placed on momentum and speed through the danger zone. Officers who had criticized the Canadian approach now studied it carefully. Some admitted they had been wrong about the tactics. Others simply adopted the methods without acknowledging where they came from. By August, as Allied forces broke out from Normandy and raced across France, the aggressive Canadian style had become common. Units that kept moving and maintained pressure consistently performed better than units following old, cautious methods. The transformation was remarkable and undeniable. What had been considered reckless in June was standard practice by September. Major General Rod Keller, the man who had developed and championed these tactics, did not live to see full recognition. On August 8, 1944, just 2 months after D-Day, Keller was seriously wounded during the battle for Caen. A German artillery shell exploded near his command post. Shrapnel tore through his leg and back, causing severe injuries. He was evacuated to England and spent months in the hospital recovering. His combat command was over, his fighting days were done. When Keller finally recovered enough to travel, he returned to Canada. The war in Europe was still raging, but Keller would not lead troops again. He was given administrative positions and attended ceremonies. But he was not in the field anymore, and the injury had ended his career at the moment of his greatest triumph. In the years immediately after the war, Keller received surprisingly little public recognition. Canada celebrated its D-Day veterans with parades, medals, and monuments, but Keller himself faded into the background of history. He was not a charismatic speaker or a self-promoter. He did not write memoirs or seek publicity. Many Canadians knew the story of Juno Beach but did not know the name of the general who had planned the tactics. It was American commanders who first began to publicly credit Keller and the Canadian approach. In 1948, Omar Bradley published his war memoirs. In them, he devoted several pages to what he had witnessed at Juno Beach. Bradley admitted that he had been skeptical of the Canadian methods before D-Day. He described watching through binoculars as the Canadians advanced faster and farther than anyone expected. He wrote that the experience had taught him that sometimes innovation comes from unexpected places. Sometimes the people everyone underestimates are the ones who change everything. By the 1950s, military historians were calling Juno Beach one of the most successful amphibious assaults in history. The formal recognition of Canadian tactics came in 1946, when military academies updated their curriculum. Fort Benning in the United States and Sandhurst in England both began teaching what instructors called momentum doctrine. They did not always call it the Juno Beach method or give credit to Keller by name, but the core principles came directly from what the Canadians had proven on D-Day: speed through the danger zone, continuous pressure, never give the enemy time to reorganize. The broader lesson went beyond just military tactics. What happened at Juno Beach demonstrated something important about innovation and human nature. The people who are most likely to try radical new approaches are often those who have the most to prove. The Canadians had been dismissed as colonial troops by some officers. They had suffered the disaster at Dieppe and carried that shame. They carried the weight of low expectations and being underestimated. That weight did not crush them. Instead, it motivated them to find a better way. This pattern appears throughout history in every field of human endeavor. The outsiders, the underdogs, the ones who are underestimated often become the innovators. They have less invested in the old ways of doing things. They have more to gain from trying something new and taking risks. They are willing to challenge conventional wisdom when established powers will not. The Canadians at Juno Beach were not the first to demonstrate this principle, and they would not be the last. Modern militaries still study the Juno Beach operation in engineering schools and staff colleges. The principles that Keller and his men demonstrated remain relevant today. Military doctrine still emphasizes momentum in offensive operations. The idea of speed through the danger zone is taught in every military academy in the world. British military historian John Keegan wrote about the Canadian achievement at Juno Beach. His words captured what made that day so significant. He stated that at the end of D-Day, Canadian forward elements stood deeper into France than those of any other division. The opposition the Canadians faced was stronger than that of any other beach save Omaha. That was an accomplishment in which the whole nation could take considerable pride. The story of the Regina rifles and Royal Winnipeg rifles on D-Day teaches us something profound. Sometimes the fastest way through a difficult situation is straight through it, not around it. Sometimes maintaining forward momentum is safer than stopping to be cautious. Sometimes the conventional wisdom is wrong, and questioning it can save lives. The story also teaches us about the danger of underestimating people. The American and British commanders who dismissed the Canadians as inexperienced colonials were proven wrong within hours. Their assumptions about who could innovate and who could not were shattered by reality. Today, we still fall into the same trap of underestimation. We assume that innovation comes from prestigious institutions or established experts. We overlook the people on the margins, the ones with something to prove. Juno Beach reminds us to question those assumptions and stay open to unexpected sources of wisdom. Rod Keller died in 1954 at the age of 52. His health never fully recovered from the wounds he received at Caen. At his funeral, a small group of veterans from the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division served as pallbearers. They were the men who had stormed Juno Beach 10 years earlier. They knew what Keller had done for them. They knew his tactics had saved lives. They knew that he had given them a chance when others expected them to fail. In the decades since, historians have continued to study D-Day with intense focus. They have written thousands of books and articles analyzing every aspect of the invasion, and increasingly, they point to Juno Beach as the tactical masterpiece of the operation. Not because it was the bloodiest, not because it involved the most troops, but because it demonstrated that courage combined with innovation can overcome obstacles that seem impossible. The final lesson of Juno Beach is perhaps the most important. National pride, when channeled properly, can be an incredible force for good. The Canadian soldiers on that beach were not just fighting for victory. They were fighting to prove that their nation belonged among the great powers. They were fighting to show that being underestimated was a mistake. They were fighting for respect and recognition. And that desire for respect, that determination to prove themselves, gave them an edge. It gave them an advantage that no amount of equipment or training could provide. Sometimes having something to prove is the greatest tactical advantage of all. The Germans at Juno Beach had better fortifications, more artillery, and years of preparation. But they faced an enemy that refused to be stopped. They faced soldiers who would rather die moving forward than live with the shame of failure. That spirit, that determination, that refusal to accept limits is what changed history on June 6, 1944. And it remains a lesson worth remembering today. They weren't supposed to be this far inland by nightfall, but the Regina rifles and Royal Winnipeg rifles proved that sometimes the impossible is just a challenge waiting to be overcome. 9 miles into occupied France, farther than any other Allied unit on D-Day, not because they were stronger or better equipped, but because they refused to accept limitations, because they had something to prove and they proved it beyond all doubt. That is the legacy of Juno Beach, and it will never be forgotten.